All right, we'll wait a few minutes for everyone to join.
Great. We have some people who've been invited, who've been allowed in so far.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Welcome to the webinar. We'll get started here in just a few minutes. Appreciate you guys joining. We've got about five people who've joined so far. We're gonna just give it a couple minutes here to see if everybody else will see who else is going to join before we get started. Ryan, I'm just confirming that I can see your question in the session. Great. So it's a little bit afternoon. We've got a couple of folks from Eccker Sports are on the webinar, as well as we've got about 3 or 4 folks that have joined. As you can see, there's an opportunity to put questions, which both Tori and I can see any questions that you write in the Q&A component. And as this webinar goes on, if you have questions or things that you'd like to discuss or talk about, we can, you can certainly enter questions in there. And then I will answer. And Tim Mullins, I can see that you put a note in there. So we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome to the name, image, and likeness overview. As we all are aware, name, image, and likeness has been quite a disruptive force in athletics across the United States over the last 2 years. And what we wanted to do today was provide some context around how we've arrived at where we are, talk a little bit about some of the things that we are hearing from athletic directors and coaches around the country at the high school level with regards to how they manage this in their programs, and then also talk a little bit about ways that athletes and families are thinking about name, image, and likeness from a standpoint of their benefit and what they're looking for. So that's what we're going to go ahead and cover today. So, over the last particularly 2 or 3 months, we have seen a huge change in the number of states that are allowing high school student athletes to participate in name, image, and likeness from a formal perspective. At Eccker Sports, we work with 10 state high school athletic associations, and in several of those, we've helped them actually craft the language that they're using today to clarify their stance on name, image, and likeness. And the reason that we're seeing a lot of states, what the executive directors of those state high school athletic associations are telling us, is that they're worried about 2 things. One, they're worried that if they don't get ahead of the name, image, and likeness issue at the high school level, that they'll be liable and pulled into lawsuits from student athletes and their families who want to have the ability to participate in it as kids in other states where it's legal. So, for example, today in Georgia or Texas or Mississippi or Alabama, if a high school athlete was to do a name, image, and likeness endorsement type deal and make money, there is a potential that those high school athletic associations could rule them ineligible to play. However, in Oklahoma or Louisiana or Tennessee or California or Ohio, New York, in those states, the kids can. And so there's some pressure now on the high school athletic associations from that, what people are now starting to refer to unfair practices in the states where name, image, and likeness is not allowed. So that's one pressure. The second pressure is that they're worried that if the state legislative bodies in those states write laws on how name, image, and likeness should be looking towards how name, image, and likeness should be dealt with at the high school level, that they'll craft laws and regulations that don't actually work in the high school level. And yet, particularly the athletic directors are really concerned that a state senator may force something upon them that is either hard to implement, hard to regulate, hard to execute. And so they want to try to get ahead of this. So what we've seen just last week, Rhode Island, the state of Washington, Tennessee, and Pennsylvania have all, clarified that student athletes are allowed to participate in endorsement deals and maintain their eligibility, but they can't use school logos and school associate or the high school athletic association logos. So that's kind of set the stage for where we are today. And we expect to see probably another 3 or 4 states in the coming weeks also clarify their stance on name, image, and likeness, similar to what we've seen in Tennessee, Rhode Island, Oklahoma, and some of these others recently. So if we look at the map and see how fast this happened, April of this year, there were 8 states that allowed name, image, and likeness to be available for high school athletes in that level. There were 26 states where at the time we're just saying we're not allowing this to happen in the high school level. And then there were some states that were like, well, we got to figure this out. Today, you can see the map. As of today, there's now 22 states, and then in the District of Columbia are now allowing this to happen in a way. And even in the state of Texas, where it's prohibited, the UIL won't prohibit student athletes from endorsing products in their local neighborhoods, as long as whatever they're getting paid is commensurate to what somebody else would get paid for those things. So that's what we're seeing today. And as we mentioned, the reason that that's an issue is because the state athletic association want to avoid lawsuits for what is perceived as unfair practices, and they want to act before state legislature creates regulations that don't make sense to them. So how did we get to where we are? So let's talk about some of the important concepts and terminology around name, image, and likeness. So the NCAA was brought under suit by a lawsuit from, well, originally started with the O'Bannon issue. So Ed O'Bannon was a basketball player at UCLA. They won a national championship. And after that championship that summer, he was at a friend's house and his friend was playing NCAA basketball. And he chose UCLA as his team. And there was Ed O'Bannon as a character in this video game that the NCAA had been paid millions of dollars for the rights to actually produce. And Ed asked, well, why am I not getting paid for that? Why don't I get to participate? That's me that they've got out there. And he originally filed a lawsuit that went and said that student athletes should be able to participate. The result of that was that the NCAA began allowing student athletes to start earning more than just the cost of education. So if you lived in Los Angeles or if you lived in Austin, Texas, you could get paid your scholarship, room and board, money for books, and in addition to that, an additional stipend. So that was the kind of the first step in the process. Subsequent to that, Alston and a bunch of other athletes said, why is it that the NCAA can actually control the amount of money that we earn? And so that lawsuit went all the way to the Supreme Court. And what the Supreme Court ruled was the NCAA was in violation of the Sherman Act, which is an antitrust law, because the NCAA was limiting what athletes could make based on the idea that amateurism was a requirement to play college athletics. And so at the time, the NCAA was trying to figure out what they were going to do if the Alston case came down, where the NCAA couldn't restrict student athletes based on that. And so when that ruling happened in July of 2021, the NCAA then said, you know what, we're going to leave this to the states. There's already states that have state laws that are on the books that have been approved or voted for that will go into effect in the next couple of years. The NCAA doesn't have authority over state law, and so they've released the responsibility for name, image, and likeness to all the states. And then what you saw during the summer of 2021 were all states writing new name, image, and likeness laws for the college athletes in those states. Those laws predominantly did not include high school athletes in them. And since those laws were originally put in place in all those states, they've been amended, changed, or removed altogether. So that's how we got to where we are. This idea that a body does not have the right to control what somebody can earn within their institutions is part of antitrust. The second thing, which is an interesting concept, is intellectual property. And that is really, you'll hear that term as it relates to name, image, and likeness, because anything that we create as individuals is intellectual property that we own. For example, this presentation that I put together is intellectual property owned by Eccker Sports and myself. And if we want to protect the rights of this thing, there's ways that we would do that through copyright or trademark so that other people couldn't take this intellectual property that we've created. Well, the same is true of an athlete. And the things that they do on social media, the content that they create, all of that stuff becomes intellectual property that they own. And what we're seeing now is athletes trying to gain the ability to protect that intellectual property. Collectives, you hear the word collective a lot, and what that means is there's organizations that are formed that are outside of a college university that have their own LLC that gets formed. They have their own financial instrument and bank account. Donors, alumni, and sponsors put money into the bank account of that collective, and then they connect with student athletes. And if a student athlete performs some duty like posts on social media, goes and signs autographs, visits a hospital, or whatever, then money from that collective gets paid to those students. And that's what the name, image, and likeness thing is you're seeing across the college landscape today. And initially, most colleges had multiple collectives were being set up for all kinds of different purposes. And now the colleges are really combining those collectives into one main entity where the money flows in from the sponsors and the alumni and then gets distributed to the student athletes, separate from the university itself. We are now starting to see in the high school market ideas that are similar to that, and we'll talk more about those things. The one thing that the NCAA did say when they said that you couldn't restrict the amount of money that people could earn, and you can't use amateurism as a criteria because of that to play, was that you couldn't do two things, what they refer to as improper inducements. So pay for play, which means you can't pay a student athlete for performance. So if they score a touchdown, they get certain money. If they hit so many 3-pointers, they get certain money. If they have a personal record on the track, that they get more money. And then the second thing is, and they're specific about this, you couldn't use name, image, and likeness inducements to get people to enroll in a school or to have them stay in the school. And so what the NCAA is really focused on right now is trying to figure out how can they enforce the idea around that. And so if you have student athletes that are being recruited, it's really important to give them guidance on a university can't tell you that, hey, if you're going to come here, you're going to make this much money. What they can tell you is that in our NIL collective, there's opportunities to make money, and you have to visit with them about that. But recruiting them based on that is a improper inducement based on the NCAA. So it's something to talk to your student athletes about. And then the last piece of it, a couple of months ago, the NCAA issued a guidance, updated guidance on their stance around name, image, and likeness, where they wanted to make sure that only coaches and university officials can be involved in the recruiting process of a student athlete, a prospective student athlete. So what they are looking for is any communication between a student athlete and somebody that's not a coach on the staff. So somebody that's part of the collective, an alumni, a booster, whatever, that indicates that, hey, if you come here, we will take care of you, or as part of the recruiting process. That's what the NCAA is really focused on, is try to see if they can stop. So if you have student athletes that are being recruited, you might want to guide them to understand that they should not be having direct conversations, particularly over email or text, with anybody other than a coach on staff, because if the NCAA ever looked at that, that could potentially become an issue for them. When we think about name, image, and likeness, and I'm gonna go for about 15 minutes, and then we're gonna stop, and we'll have a Q&A session. So if you have questions that come up through this process or things that you want to talk about, you can enter those into the Q&A piece, and we'll try to address all the questions. The first thing that we talk about when we talk about financial literacy is really making sure that student athletes have legal representation if they're going to enter into agreements on NIL opportunities. So if you're in a state like Tennessee now, or Oklahoma or Louisiana, and you have a student athlete that's doing an NIL deal with a local business in the community or whatever, make sure that you have an attorney review the obligations of any agreement that they sign. We've seen a lot of agreements between brands and sponsors with student athletes that don't have any termination date, for example. We see agreements that don't have mutual indemnification in those agreements. And these are legal terms that, unless you negotiate contracts or you are an attorney, that they're very difficult to understand. So it's really important that before any student athlete signs a legal agreement, that there's somebody that reviews it from a legal perspective. Also, it's important to understand any money earned from name, image, and likeness activities over $400 in a calendar year will be subject to IRS taxes. So if you get contracted by a company to do social media posts, if a student athlete goes and signs autographs and gets paid $100 or $500 or $1,000, they'll receive a 1099 at the end of the year, requiring them to pay taxes on that. So we need to make sure that the student athletes and their families understand that they need to set money aside in those instances for taxes. As we talked about with recruiting visits, when visiting colleges, make sure that you understand the rules. So, for example, in the state of Texas today, a college football coach at Texas, Texas A&M, Rice, UTSA, Texas Tech, Baylor, TCU, those coaches, it's prohibited by state law in Texas for those coaches to discuss name, image, and likeness with a prospective student athlete. In Alabama, they had a very similar law, but then they rescinded that law so that it doesn't exist anymore. So in Alabama, they can talk about name, image, and likeness on a recruiting trip. If the student athlete's being recruited by multiple schools in multiple states, and they're having conversations in Texas, and they let the guys in Alabama know that, or Ohio, that could potentially cause problems for both the student athlete and the coaches in Texas as well. So it's really important to understand what the rules are in each state. And in our resource hub that we offer at Eccker Sports, you can actually pull up the policy and procedure of every university in every state. And then financial aid. If a student athlete does participate in name, image, and likeness and earn money from a name, image, and likeness opportunity, it will impact the financial aid ability for financial aid money. It will not impact scholarship dollars. But if you're trying to do a Pell Grant or something along those lines, the earnings from name, image, and likeness will go into the expected family contribution line, which could then affect the amount of Pell Grant monies that are available. So we've seen a couple of situations where a student athlete was offered a couple of $1,000s in money for a name, image, and likeness deal. But when we compared that to the family earnings and saw what that would do to their expected contribution, they realized that they potentially could lose almost $20,000 in Pell Grant money over the course of the college experience. So something also to be thoughtful for. And then the last kind of component that we talk about is image and branding. Having a digital presence is almost a requirement, in our society today. And being intentional and thoughtful about how do you actually create your digital brand so that you represent who you are, and it's the type of brand that people want to interact with, and it's the type of identity that people want to be engaged with and follow. And so working with specific people around developing a brand is also something important for any student athlete that's interested in looking at this thing. So these are just kind of the main kind of things to think about when you're trying to guide or advise a student athlete on name, image, and likeness. the ways that most student athletes are earning money through name, image, and likeness is by one, promoting local or corporate entities within the area that they live, because their notoriety, their identity is known in those areas. We also see people promoting their own business and merchandise. So there are student athletes today that have 300,000 to 400,000 followers, that when they post on TikTok or post on Instagram or post on Twitter, they have a tremendous amount of engagement with their followers. Brands are very anxious to be participating in those types of engagements and communications. And so when they see athletes that have the ability to have that level of engagement, they want to get them involved. There's an athlete in Oklahoma who's a high school athlete that has 1 million followers on TikTok. And every time he does a post, he earns close to $10,000 because of the way TikTok pays for the content developers. So when you think about the types of value that these, and by the way, none of that has to do with his football or what he does with the high school that he's in. But when you think about the type of value you can create for yourself as an independent business, that's an example. Another way that student athletes get paid for name, image, and likeness opportunities through appearances, doing autographs, going to camps, going to hospitals and things like that. There are several scenarios where student athletes get paid through what we call in-kind payment. So a shoe company may provide a certain number of pairs of shoes to a student athlete in consideration of that student athlete endorsing them on social media, etc. Same with beverages and different things like that. It's important to also know if a student athlete does an NIL deal along with, and they get payment in kind that is worth more than $400 a year, they will be taxed on the value of that stuff that they received as a result of the deal that they did for their NIL stuff. And then we talked about collectives, setting up scenarios where booster money is put into a collective financial instrument and gets distributed to athletes based on things that they do. So when we think about the student athlete, right, the main thing that they're trying to figure out right now with name, image, and likeness is how to maximize their NIL value. How do they build a brand that's valuable? How do they make money with the brand and do it so that they don't compromise their eligibility? And one of the things that we're doing at Eccker Sports is we've built an NIL playbook program that provides information and tools to families and student athletes so they can figure out how to do that in an effective way and maintain their compliance. For the educators that are on the call, what we hear from them is managing the chaos of this in their school districts, right? So parents are asking questions, coaches are asking questions. How do you create the NIL policies and procedures for your program so that you can effectively manage this stuff on a day-to-day basis? So in Tennessee, we're going to be doing a webinar for the coaches in Tennessee right after Christmas to help them figure out how to deal with it now that NIL is allowed in those states. There's lots of athletic directors who we've met with that are wanting to put together in a program by which they can view what's happening with the NIL opportunities that their student athletes are getting into and make sure that they're legitimate, first of all, so that we protect the student athletes, that they don't get involved in some sort of a relationship with somebody that's not good for them. And then secondly, how to do it so that it's fair across all of the student athletes across all the schools that they're responsible for. So again, at Eccker Sports, we provide workshops on NIL. We provide school policy and procedure best practices, how to build all of the stuff and put it together, and then the information so that that can be successful. And so we have a team of researchers that wake up every day with the sole purpose of trying to understand and uncover what's going on, what's the latest, and how to help those two stakeholder groups, the families and the educators. And we curate information on a daily basis. We have a weekly newsletter. We put it into our resource hub and all the stuff that's part of the NIL membership. And then we provide a lot of support from that perspective. So as we're going into the question Q&A scenario, if you want to sign up to become a member, It's $50 to be a member for a year of the NIL playbook that offers the video courses, the tools, and the resource hub. If you sign up today with this QR code, you can get it for half price. And we would encourage you to do so using that code or that QR code and that promo code when you get signed up. So with that, I know that was a lot of information in a short period of time, and I hope it was useful. Are there any questions, Tori, that anybody would like that anybody's put into the Q&A that we can discuss?
Yeah, to start it off, we got a question that says, what do you attribute to the rapid change in the number of high school states allowing NIL this year?
Yeah, I think it's the things that we've talked about. There's so Louisiana, we worked with back in April, and the executive director there felt that it was appropriate for high school athletes to have the opportunity to earn money based on their name, image, and likeness if they could. And they started really the the landslide of it. And they created a positioning statement that said there's nothing in their bylaws that actually prohibited name, image, and likeness, but they just wanted to make sure that kids could do that. But in order to do it right, they mandated that the principals and athletic directors across the state be certified and understand NIL and become part of the NIL playbook. Since then, all of the states that we've worked with, Oklahoma, Idaho, Oregon, New York, Massachusetts, all of them have all said the same thing, which was one, they wanted to be ahead of the scenario where they were dragged into a lawsuit by student athletes or different entities. And two, they wanted to put something in place that they could manage that wasn't mandated to them through state legislature. So that's why most of the states have gone, and we've seen pretty consistent flow every month of states that are doing that. And we're monitoring their board meetings, and we're talking to their executives and their executive directors on this. And we expect to see, 3 or 4 more here in the coming weeks.
Awesome. Another question is, how do coaches and administrators best prepare their staff to handle questions and scenarios from parents and student athletes?
So what we recommend is putting together a NIL policy and procedure that includes making sure we understand what is permissible and what is not. So for example, in most of the states that we've talked about, they don't allow student athletes to endorse firearms or alcohol products or adult entertainment type stuff or gambling, right? And so the first thing is we have to establish a policy saying this is what we can and can't do. And then we have to have a way to have a visibility into actually what transactions are happening. At Eccker Sports, we have a partner that has a software tool that a athletic department could use that would have all of the athletes in that in the software platform, and then it would identify all of the companies or boosters or alumni, whoever that would want to actually interact, and then would create a visibility into that process so that you can manage whatever the policy and procedure are that gets put in place. So that's really the starting point. And then also being educated, right? All the things that we've talked about with financial literacy, legal representation, building a digital brand, right? We need our administrators to be educated on those things so that they can make good decisions about what to do.
Absolutely. We got another question that says, best financial vehicle for student athletes who strategically plan for college calculation. Sorry, that's what
matriculation. Yeah, thanks for that question. So I don't know that there's a financial plan. We're not financial planners at Eccker Sports, right? What we recommend is people work with people who are certified as financial planners to think about how do these things impact you from a standpoint of financial aid and from a standpoint of tax obligations. As we look at what we're doing, we make people aware of the things that they're responsible for as it relates to NIL and the earnings that come with that. But we don't recommend any specific financial tool or implement to go through that, if that makes sense. Next question, Tori.
Yes. Is the top 1% of student athletes the only ones getting these NIL deals?
No, that's a really good question. Obviously, the top 1% of student athletes, we read about them, we hear about them and the massive deals that they're doing, right? But in fact, at the college level today, some of the biggest NIL endorsement deals are being done with student athletes that aren't playing football or men's basketball. So there's a gymnast at LSU, for example, who has a tremendous social media following and has done very well from an NIL perspective. There's a couple of female basketball players that were at Fresno State that transferred to Miami that have done great things. And even at the high school level in the states that you see NIL deals being done, a lot of times it's with female athletes or athletes of sports outside of football. And the reason for that is because those athletes have created a persona of themselves, both on and off the field or court, that people want to engage with. And what brands are interested in is they're interested in really having intimate conversations with people that are associated to certain brands. And because of the way that they've developed their brand, these student athletes, they're getting a lot of opportunities that way. So certainly the top 1% are always going to have great opportunities, but there's tremendous opportunity for everyone else as it relates to that as well.
Great. And then we had another one that said, how long is this 50% off promo code good for?
What did we decide, Corey?
It's going until December 31st. So you have now until the end of the year to use this promo code. So you have about 2 weeks. And you can do that by scanning this QR code and typing in the code DEC50 to get $25 off. All right, and then one more question. Can international participants also receive NIL benefits at U.S. colleges?
That's a good question. So if you think about it, right? So the reason that the NCAA changed their policy on NIL is because of an antitrust law that the Supreme Court ruled was violating the rights of U.S. citizens. So as it relates to international students, they don't maintain those same rights. So generally speaking, international students are not allowed to participate in name, image, and likeness deals unless they get an exemption from the NCAA. And there have been a few examples of that, of student athletes. There was one in Chicago that filed an appeal to the NCAA, was allowed to do a name, image, and likeness deal with a company that they had a good relationship with and maintain their eligibility to play in college. So yes, that is not for international student athletes unless they are able to get an exemption from the NCAA.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for this information, and thank you to everyone who joined. I will be sending an email to all of you with the recorded webinar, so you can have this to keep. And again, if you want to sign up for your annual NIL playbook and subscription, you can use the code DEC50 by scanning that QR code or going to our homepage and clicking register in the top right. You have until the 31st to use this promo code. Ignore the typo that says by the 14th, because that's today. But again, thank you all for joining, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, thanks for coming in. If anybody has any specific questions or wants to talk further about any topic, you can reach me by just emailing me at tim@eckersports.com, and I'd be happy to help any way we can. That's what our mission is, to help educators and families so that everybody can thrive on this process. Have a happy holiday and a happy new year, and we look forward to talking with you soon.
Thanks, everyone.